In September of 2015, the United States government made a quiet announcement that ended a tradition stretching back 7 decades. The president would no longer stay at the Waldorf Astoria. Neither would the Secretary of State. The U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, who had lived on the hotel's 42nd floor since 1947, would be moving out. Every September for nearly 70 years, 2 floors of the Waldorf had served as the temporary headquarters for American diplomacy during the United Nations General Assembly. Now those floors would sit empty. The reason was simple and extraordinary. A Chinese insurance company had purchased America's most famous hotel for nearly $2 billion. And the U.S. government feared what might be listening inside the walls. To understand how a hotel became a palace of secrets and how that palace fell, we need to start where all great New York stories begin. With a family feud. Before we explore this story of power, secrets, and the quiet end of an era, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by the hidden history of America's most iconic places, subscribe so you don't miss our next investigation. Now, let's begin with two cousins who hated each other. 5th Avenue, 1890. William Waldorf Astor stood in front of his family's mansion and made a decision that would reshape New York forever. He would tear it down. His mother had died, and by every tradition the Astor family respected, his wife should now be known as the Mrs. Astor. The title mattered in Gilded Age New York. It signified who controlled society, who decided which families received invitations to the balls that defined the social season, and which families would be excluded. It meant power over the 400 families who supposedly could fit in Caroline Astor's ballroom. But William's aunt, Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor, refused to yield. She had married William's uncle and spent 2 decades building her position as the gatekeeper of New York's elite. She kept a list. If your name did not appear on it, no door would open. Caroline insisted that she, not William's wife, deserved the title. The dispute might have ended with stern letters and cold receptions at society functions. Instead, William chose revenge. He demolished his mansion and announced plans to build a 13-story hotel on the site, right next to his aunt's home. The message was unmistakable. If Caroline would not acknowledge his wife's social position, he would make her life in that neighborhood unbearable. The construction noise alone would be intolerable. But more than that, the presence of a commercial hotel with strangers coming and going at all hours would destroy the residential character of the block. It was social warfare conducted through architecture. The Waldorf Hotel opened on March 13th, 1893. Designed by Henry Janeway Hardenberg in the German Renaissance style, it stood 225 feet high with 450 guest rooms, 15 public dining and reception rooms, and another 100 rooms for servants and staff. The construction cost reached $5 million. In today's terms, that figure approaches $100 to $56 million. The building featured loggias, balconies, and an interior garden court. The public rooms included the Empire Room, the Astor Gallery, and the Marie Antoinette Parlor, which contained furniture and decorations supposedly from the French Queen's apartments at Versailles. Caroline Astor reportedly called it a glorified tavern. The noise, the construction, the commercial bustle in what had been a quiet residential neighborhood, William had designed it all to make her life unbearable. Within 3 years, she capitulated. Caroline moved uptown to a mansion at 65th Street and 5th Avenue, far from the hotel that loomed over her old home. Her son, John Jacob Astor IV, saw an opportunity where his mother saw defeat. In 1897, he built an even taller hotel on the adjacent lot where his mother's mansion had stood. The Astoria rose 16 stories, 270 feet into the Manhattan sky, 550 guest rooms, 25 public dining and reception spaces. It dwarfed the Waldorf in every dimension. The architecture followed the same German Renaissance style, ensuring the buildings would appear as a unified whole. The cousins, despite their mutual dislike, reached a truce. A 300-foot marble corridor connected the two buildings at the ground floor. They called it Peacock Alley after the wealthy who strutted through it displaying their finery, their jewelry, their elaborate gowns and tailored suits. The combined Waldorf Astoria had 1,300 bedrooms and 178 bathrooms. It was the largest hotel in the world. Born from spite, connected by compromise, it would become something neither cousin anticipated. Not just a hotel, but the living room of American power. The man who made it work was a Prussian immigrant who had started in kitchens, George C. Bolt had risen from kitchen staff to manage Philadelphia's prestigious Bellevue Stratford Hotel before William Waldorf Astor hired him to run the new Waldorf in 1893. Bolt understood luxury, but he also understood people. He knew that true hospitality meant anticipating needs before guests articulated them. His wife, Louisa, believed 13 was a lucky number. She persuaded her husband to add 2 floors to the original 11-story plan, bringing the total to 13. Bolt pioneered innovations that would define luxury hospitality for generations. Room service, delivered via dumbwaiter directly to guest rooms, allowed people to dine privately without descending to the public dining rooms. Assistant managers stationed in the lobby were trained to recognize returning guests by sight and address their preferences before they were spoken. The hotel featured electricity throughout at a time when most buildings still relied on gas lighting. Private bathrooms appeared in many rooms, revolutionary for 1893, when most hotels still had shared facilities down the hall. But it was the food that made the Waldorf legendary. Oscar Cherky arrived from Switzerland in 1893 as the hotel's maître d'hôtel. He would stay for 50 years. Oscar of the Waldorf, they called him. He became not just an employee, but a cultural institution, a culinary superstar whose name appeared in newspapers across the country. Between 1893 and 1896, he created the Waldorf salad, apples, celery, and mayonnaise, later modified to include walnuts. He invented Eggs Benedict after a conversation with a hungover stockbroker who needed something gentle for his stomach. He popularized Thousand Island dressing, veal Oscar, and red velvet cake. His cookbook, published in 1896, codified recipes that would outlast the building itself. The volume went through multiple editions and remained in print for decades. On February 11th, 1899, Oscar hosted a dinner that the New York Herald Tribune cited as the city's costliest at the time. $250 per guest, which translates to roughly $8,000 today. The menu featured Blue Point oysters on the half shell, green turtle soup, lobster Newburg, ruddy duck with wild rice, terrapin Maryland style, and blue raspberries with heavy cream. The wines included Chateau d'Yquem and Moet et Chandon. 60 guests attended. The total cost exceeded $15,000, approaching $500,000 in current terms. The Waldorf Astoria earned $4.5 million in its first year of combined operations. In today's economy, that represents approximately $140 million in annual revenue from a single property. The famous bar became a favorite haunt of Diamond Jim Brady, who reportedly spent $500,000 annually on food and entertainment. Buffalo Bill Cody stayed there between performances of his Wild West show. Bat Masterson, the former frontier lawman turned sports writer, held court in the lobby. President William McKinley visited in 1897. The New York Times proclaimed it a palace. For 3 decades, the Waldorf Astoria at 34th Street and 5th Avenue defined what luxury meant in America. If you wanted to see wealth, power, and influence gathered in one place, you went to the Waldorf. If you wanted to be seen, you dined at Oscar's tables. By the early 1920s, the hotel had everything. Everything except what it would need most, the ability to stay relevant. By the mid-1920s, the elegant social life of New York had moved 15 blocks north. The wealthy families who had defined the city's social geography were building new mansions along Fifth Avenue in the 50s and 60s. Competition arrived from newer, more modern hotels. The Hotel Astor opened in 1904 at Broadway and 44th Street. So did the St. Regis at 5th Avenue and 55th Street, built by John Jacob Astor IV as a companion to the Waldorf Astoria. The Knickerbocker followed in 1906. The Plaza opened in 1907. The Savoy Plaza in 1927. These newer properties offered updated mechanical systems, more bathrooms, better ventilation, and modern amenities. the aging Waldorf struggled to match. The Waldorf Astoria at 34th Street was becoming dated. The neighborhood had changed. What had once been the height of residential fashion now stood surrounded by department stores, office buildings, and commercial development. The hotel's owners faced a choice: invest millions in renovation and compete with newer properties, or sell to the highest bidder. The hotel closed on May 3, 1929. Developers led by former New York Governor Al Smith and businessman John J. Raskob had purchased the site to build the world's tallest office tower. The Empire State Building would rise where the Waldorf Astoria had stood. On October 1, 1929, demolition began with a somber rooftop ceremony. Smith reportedly said that this historic building, known all over the world, must come down in the northward march of progress. It was the same month the stock market crashed. The timing was almost poetic. The hotel that had symbolized Gilded Age excess and wealth was being demolished just as the economic system that produced it collapsed. The New York Times sent reporters to document the destruction. Yawning holes marked the doorways where liveried attendants greeted distinguished guests, they wrote. Men in overalls bustle amid dust and debris in Peacock Alley. The men's cafe, once a favorite haunt of millionaires, and the giant ballrooms are bare. Plaster dust coats the Marie Antoinette parlor where presidents once dined. Within months, the Waldorf Astoria was gone. 1,300 rooms demolished. 34 years of history erased. The site where two cousins had waged war with architecture now stood empty, a massive hole in Midtown Manhattan, waiting for something even taller. The Empire State Building would rise there, becoming the tallest structure in the world, but the name would return. 15 blocks north, on land owned by a railroad, a new palace was already being planned, and this time it would become something far more significant than a hotel for the wealthy. It would become the place where American power lived. The idea of building the world's largest hotel in the summer of 1929 seemed bold. By October, it seemed insane. The stock market had collapsed. The Depression was beginning. Banks were failing. Construction projects across the country were being abandoned, half-finished. Some investors wanted to walk away from the Waldorf project entirely, but the New York Central Railroad owned the land, the site of a former power plant for Grand Central Terminal on Park Avenue between 49th and 50th Streets. The railroad had promised $10 million toward construction costs and decided to honor their commitment. The building would be constructed on air rights above the railroad's tracks, which meant rental income for the railroad in perpetuity. The other investors, seeing the railroad's commitment, agreed to continue. Ground broke in early 1930. Architects Schulze and Weaver designed a 47-story Art Deco tower that would occupy an entire city block, from Park Avenue to Lexington Avenue, from 49th Street to 50th Street. The firm had previously designed the Waldorf Astoria's competitor, the Pierre Hotel, and brought similar elegance to this commission. Lloyd Morgan, a partner at the firm, created a hybrid building, part hotel, part residential tower. The Waldorf Towers would rise as a slender central column with its own private entrance on 50th Street and separate elevators serving residential floors from the 28th story upward. The Thompson Starrett Company executed the construction in only 2 years, despite the economic chaos surrounding them. 2,200 rooms, 625 feet tall. Built atop the railroad tracks using air rights, above Grand Central, the structure required innovative engineering to distribute the building's weight across the existing rail infrastructure. The exterior featured gray Waldorf limestone and light-colored brick. Bronze ornamentations marked the entrances. Twin towers rose from a limestone base. The interior was even more ambitious. The Park Avenue entrance opened into a lobby featuring 13 murals and a floor mosaic by French artist Louis Regal depicting the Wheel of Life. Black marble columns supported a vaulted ceiling. The grand ballroom could accommodate 1,500 guests for dinner. The starlight roof, an open-air dining and dancing space, offered views across Midtown. Private dining rooms numbered in the dozens, each decorated in a different historical style. The hotel installed more than 1,400 private bathrooms, virtually unheard of in 1931. The mechanical systems represented the latest technology, air conditioning throughout, high-speed elevators, pneumatic tubes for communication between floors. On October 1st, 1931, exactly 2 years after demolition had begun on the old hotel, the new Waldorf Astoria opened its doors. President Herbert Hoover spoke by radio from the White House. His voice transmitted to 2,000 guests assembled in the grand ballroom. The opening of the new Waldorf Astoria marks the measure of a nation's growth in power, in comfort, and in artistry, he said. It is an exhibition of courage and confidence to the whole nation. The words rang with optimism. The reality was more sobering. By the end of the opening day, the hotel had only 500 guests in 2,200 rooms. The Depression had emptied New York of travelers. Business conventions had been canceled. Wealthy families cut back on entertaining. The hotel struggled financially for its first 8 years. Full profitability would not arrive until 1939 as the economy slowly recovered. But the hotel would not stay empty long. Within a decade, it would become what its predecessor had been, the center of American power. Only this time, the power would be political rather than purely social. Beneath the hotel, accessible through an unmarked brass door on 49th Street, lay something even most guests didn't know existed. Track 61, part of Grand Central's Lexington Yard, a 12-track storage area built in the 1910s to serve the terminal's power plant and store equipment. When the Waldorf rose atop these tracks in the early 1930s, the platform found a new purpose. A large freight elevator, specifically designed to accommodate automobiles, connected Track 61 to the hotel's garage on the ground level. The track could serve as a private arrival point for important guests who wanted to avoid public attention. Presidents could arrive unseen. Diplomats could come and go without photographers capturing their movements. The press could not monitor who entered the building through the underground entrance. General John J. Pershing used it first in 1938. The commander of American forces in World War I had suffered a heart attack, and the Secret Service wanted to spare him the physical exertion and public attention of entering through the main lobby. But the most famous user was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. On October 21, 1944, Roosevelt made a campaign stop in New York during his fourth presidential race. He delivered a motorcade address through the city, then arrived at the Waldorf Astoria for a private dinner. Secret Service logs document his departure later that evening. At 10:05 p.m., the president left the hotel via East Side Lexington Avenue elevator, the memorandum states. He then proceeded via New York Central elevators to the New York Central Railroad siding, located in the basement of the hotel. Roosevelt descended into the basement level, was transferred to his presidential rail car, and departed for the journey home to Hyde Park. He used the track to hide his paralysis from polio. The American public knew the president had suffered from polio in the 1920s, but they did not fully understand the extent of his disability. The press cooperated in maintaining the fiction that Roosevelt could walk unassisted. Photographs showing him in a wheelchair were extremely rare. Track 61 allowed him to avoid the cameras entirely during arrival and departure. For decades, a compelling myth persisted that Roosevelt had his own special armored rail car permanently parked on Track 61, that his limousine could drive directly into this rail car through specially modified doors, that he maintained a secret presidential escape route beneath Manhattan. The story appeared in books, articles, and documentaries. It was romantic. It suggested layers of secret history beneath the city. It was also false. The rail car that sat on Track 61 for many years was New York Central Baggage Car 002, later donated to the Danbury Railway Museum in Connecticut, where researchers finally examined it closely. Not a presidential rail car at all, but a standard baggage car from the 1930s. The doors were standard size for baggage cars of that era. Approximately 6 feet wide, Roosevelt's armored limousine could not have made the turn into the car's interior given the track configuration and door width. The presidential rail car Roosevelt actually used was a heavily modified Pullman car that traveled with him on trips but was not permanently stationed in New York. Roosevelt used Track 61 exactly once, that single documented visit on October 21st, 1944. General Douglas MacArthur used the platform in 1951 after being dismissed by President Truman. He wanted to avoid the massive crowds that had gathered to see him. In 2003, the Secret Service reportedly prepared Track 61 as a potential escape route for President George W. Bush during United Nations meetings, though whether it was actually used remains classified. In 1965, Andy Warhol hosted a party for his film My Hustler in the underground platform. In 1955, a Muscular Dystrophy Association dinner and fashion show took place on the platform with 300 guests. The space became an occasional venue for events that wanted unusual New York locations. Track 61 was more than a curiosity. It was a symbol. The Waldorf had become the kind of place where presidents could arrive unseen, where power moved in secret beneath the city, where the mechanisms of governance operated away from public view. That reputation, more than any architectural detail or service innovation, would define what the hotel became over the following decades. Some presidents visited the Waldorf. 3 made it their home. Herbert Hoover moved into Suite 31A in the Waldorf Towers in December 1940, renting initially, though he did not become a permanent resident until his wife Lou died in January 1944. He lived there for 20 years until his death on October 20th, 1964. He was 90 years old. Suite 31A occupied the 31st floor with windows overlooking Park Avenue. It included a living room, dining room, bedroom, kitchen, and staff quarters. Hoover paid approximately $500 per month in rent, later increasing to around $750 as he expanded into adjacent space. From his suite, Hoover conducted one of the most productive post-presidencies in American history. At age 86, he traveled 14,000 miles and delivered 20 speeches in a single year. He maintained an office, received visitors, conducted correspondence, and wrote books. In 1945, President Harry Truman invited him to the White House to discuss European food relief. It was their first meeting since Hoover had left office in 1933. It was also the start of an unlikely friendship between two men on opposite sides of politics. Truman, a Democrat who had once campaigned against Hoover's policies, came to respect the former president's knowledge and dedication. Truman dispatched Hoover on global missions to prevent mass starvation after World War II. The former president traveled more than 50,000 miles in 3 months, visiting 38 nations to assess food needs and organize relief efforts. He returned to Germany and Austria in 1947 to evaluate conditions in the occupied zones. From 1947 to 1949, and again from 1953 to 1955, Hoover led massive reorganizations of the executive branch. The Hoover Commissions produced hundreds of recommendations for improving government efficiency, streamlining operations, and eliminating waste. More than 70% of the recommendations eventually became law, reshaping how the federal government operated. In 1962, Hoover wrote to Truman, "Yours has been a friendship which has reached deeper into my life than you know," he said. "I gave up a successful profession in 1914 to enter public service. I served through the First World War and after for a total of about 18 years, when the attack on me politically had become only that of slander. You came to my aid with a friendship which helped restore me to some useful service to the country." A living room from Suite 31A was later recreated as a permanent display at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa, preserving the furniture, artwork, and personal items exactly as Hoover had arranged them. Harry S. Truman also lived at the Waldorf Towers after leaving office in 1953, maintaining a suite for New York visits. So did Dwight D. Eisenhower, who resided there from 1967 until his death in 1969. Eisenhower maintained an office and continued to receive visitors, advise presidents, and comment on world affairs. General Douglas MacArthur kept a suite at the hotel from the 1950s until his death in 1964. His widow, Jean MacArthur, lived there from 1964 until the year 2000. A total of 48 years in the same building, she became a fixture of the Waldorf Towers, a living connection to history who occasionally granted interviews to journalists and historians. The presidential suite on the 35th floor accumulated artifacts from various administrations. John F. Kennedy's favorite rocking chair, which he used for his chronic back pain, sat in the living room. Jimmy Carter's Eagle desk set occupied the desk. Ronald Reagan's gold-frame mirror and eagle-based table furnished the bedroom. Lyndon Johnson's eagle wall sconces lit the entrance hall. MacArthur's personal desk, donated by Gene MacArthur, stood near the windows. The suite became a museum of presidential history that continued to host sitting presidents when they visited New York. But the Waldorf Towers housed more than just presidents and generals. Cole Porter, the composer and songwriter, lived in a Waldorf Towers apartment from 1934 to 1964, a span of 30 years. The hotel gave him a Steinway piano as a gift, and he composed many of his most famous songs in that apartment, including numbers for Kiss Me Kate, Can Can, and Silk Stockings. His apartment became famous for all-night parties that attracted actors, musicians, and socialites. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor maintained a suite at the Waldorf Towers for 20 years, using it as their New York residence during frequent visits from their home in France. Frank Sinatra kept a 3-bedroom suite in the Waldorf Towers from the 1970s through the 1990s, reportedly paying close to $1 million per year. According to hotel legend, Sinatra had his initials carved into the marble of the shower. Every president from Hoover through Barack Obama either stayed at or lived in the Waldorf Astoria during their time in or after office. Jimmy Carter claimed he never stayed overnight, making him the lone exception among modern presidents. Nancy Reagan was reputedly not fond of the presidential suite's decor and preferred other New York hotels. By the 1960s, the Waldorf Towers had become something unprecedented in American history. Not just a hotel, but a permanent residence for former presidents, current celebrities, and displaced royalty. The hotel where power visited had become the hotel where power lived. October 1946. The United Nations had been in New York for 8 months, moving from building to building while permanent headquarters were under construction and the First General Assembly was approaching. The challenge facing the organization was acute. Where would the international delegates stay? More than 50 nations would be represented. Delegations included people of different races, religions, and nationalities. The UN Secretariat worried about racial prejudice. Many New York hotels in 1946 still practiced de facto segregation. African American delegates might be refused rooms. Asian diplomats might face discrimination. The situation threatened to embarrass the United States and undermine the United Nations before it had fully established itself. The Waldorf Astoria became the solution. It was the only major hotel willing to welcome all delegates, regardless of race, nationality, or religion. The hotel welcomed African American guests when many other establishments wouldn't. It allowed women to dine alone in its restaurants, which was revolutionary at the time when most fine dining establishments refused unaccompanied women entry. The hotel's bar served women without requiring male escorts. These were not just business decisions, they were social breakthroughs that the hotel's prominence helped normalize across New York society. The UN delegates made the Waldorf their unofficial headquarters. In 1947, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations took up official residence in Suite 42A on the 42nd floor of the Waldorf Towers. The suite would remain the ambassador's residence for the next 68 years. Warren Austin was the first occupant. Adlai Stevenson, who served as ambassador during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, chose the Waldorf suite over a Georgian-style home on Sutton Place that was also available. He apparently preferred room service in the towers and the convenience of living in the same building where so much diplomatic activity occurred. Bill Richardson later wrote in his memoir, Richardson himself lived in the suite during his time as ambassador in the Clinton administration. The suite served another purpose beyond residential. During the 1960s, it hosted private talks between the United States and the Soviet Union. Similar to the hidden apartment inside the United Nations Secretariat building that was used for secret discussions in the 1950s, Suite 42A became a place where American and Soviet diplomats could meet informally, away from the official meeting rooms where every word was recorded and scrutinized. Every September, the State Department rented 2 entire floors of the Waldorf Towers to serve as temporary headquarters for the hundreds of U.S. diplomats, staff, and security personnel attending the United Nations General Assembly. The president typically spent several nights at the hotel during the assembly session. The Secretary of State conducted meetings in various suites. Foreign ministers from allied nations stayed in the hotel, making it possible to conduct diplomacy by simply walking down the hall. In December 1946, just 2 months after the UN arrived in New York, the Council of Foreign Ministers held a major conference at the Waldorf. Representatives of the United States, England, France, and the Soviet Union met to work out final reparations details for the defeated Axis powers. The future of Trieste, the disputed territory between Italy and Yugoslavia, was determined inside these walls. The city would become a free territory under UN protection. Author David Freeland later observed that it's hard to imagine an American hotel bearing that kind of political influence today, serving as the de facto site where the post-war European order was negotiated. In 1961, Secretary of State Dean Rusk met Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko for lunch in Suite 28A, known as the Windsor Suite because the Duke and Duchess of Windsor always stayed there during their Manhattan visits. Rusk and Gromyko discussed the Berlin crisis that had been escalating since June. Neither diplomat raised new issues or offered new proposals. Each carefully restated positions their governments had already marshaled in formal memorandums, passed back and forth through diplomatic channels since early summer. Gromyko explained in greater detail what the Soviet Union meant by terms like Western access to Berlin and the concept of a free city. Rusk, following the approach President Kennedy had established during his confrontational meeting with Khrushchev in Vienna earlier that year, laid down what the United States considered its vital interests in Germany: American, British, and French rights to remain in West Berlin, free access to the city, the right of West Berliners to choose their own government. These were interests that could not be negotiated away, Rusk made clear. The lunch changed nothing in the immediate crisis, but it established channels of communication that would prove crucial in later negotiations. In 1954, Israeli statesman and archaeologist Yigael Yadin met the Syriac Orthodox Archbishop Mar Samuel in a room in the hotel's basement. They negotiated the purchase of 4 Dead Sea Scrolls for $250,000. The scrolls had been discovered in caves near the Dead Sea in the late 1940s and had circulated through dealers and collectors. The transaction was conducted in secret, with both parties wanting to avoid publicity until the scrolls were safely transferred. The purchase united the scrolls with others already in Israeli possession and ensured their preservation for scholarship. In 1965, Pope Paul VI met President Lyndon Johnson at the Waldorf during the first papal visit to the United States. The meeting was carefully choreographed, with both sides wanting to demonstrate respect while maintaining appropriate protocol. In March 1949, the controversial World Peace Conference convened at the hotel, a gathering focused on post-World War II strategizing and rising Cold War tensions. The conference attracted both supporters who saw it as genuine peace advocacy and critics who viewed it as Soviet propaganda. Carlos P. Romulo, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines and a prominent member of the UN, kept Suite 3600 for 45 years starting in 1935, when he served as a delegate to the League of Nations and continuing through his UN service. The suite, located just below Hoover's residence, became Romulo's New York home for nearly half a century. Imelda Marcos, wife of Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, was notorious among Waldorf staff for her extravagant shopping expeditions during UN visits in the 1960s and 70s. She reportedly kept multiple suites and once spent several $100,000 in a single afternoon at New York department stores with packages delivered to the hotel. For nearly 70 years, the Waldorf Astoria served as America's unofficial diplomatic palace. Presidents stayed there every September. Ambassadors lived there year-round. The future of European cities was negotiated over lunch in its suites. Religious artifacts were purchased in its basement. Popes met presidents in its living rooms. It was, in every sense that mattered, a piece of American sovereign territory. Foreign diplomats understood that when they entered the Waldorf, they were entering American space, a building where the United States exercised effective control, even though it did not technically own the property. Which made what happened next so remarkable. The United States would voluntarily abandon that territory, not because of war or disaster, but because of who purchased it. On October 6, 2014, Hilton Worldwide announced the sale of the Waldorf Astoria to China's Anbang Insurance Group for $1.95 billion. The price set a record, most expensive hotel sale in history. A record that still stands more than a decade later. The buyer was a Beijing-based insurance conglomerate led by Wu Xiaohui, a businessman who had familial ties to the Chinese political elite through his marriage to a granddaughter of Deng Xiaoping. Anbang had pursued aggressive overseas investments throughout the early 2010s, acquiring the Waldorf as part of a global expansion strategy that included hotels, real estate, and financial companies. Across Europe, North America, and Asia, the company's rapid growth was often financed through high-leverage debt and opaque funding channels linked to state-owned banks, raising questions about where the money actually originated and whether the Chinese government stood behind Anbang's acquisitions. The deal included a 100-year management contract for Hilton, ensuring operational continuity and maintaining the Waldorf brand within the Hilton portfolio. But the terms also called for a major renovation that would transform the hotel's configuration. Anbang announced plans to convert the property from purely hotel use into a mixed-use development with both hotel rooms and luxury condominiums. The renovation language raised immediate alarms in Washington among security officials who understood what major renovations could mean. Perfect cover for installing surveillance equipment, microphones in walls, cameras in light fixtures, recording devices in ventilation systems, the kind of comprehensive monitoring infrastructure that would be nearly impossible to detect once the renovation was complete. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, known as CFIUS, launched a review of the transaction. The committee, composed of representatives from the Treasury Department, Defense Department, State Department, and other agencies, has authority to block foreign acquisitions of American assets that raise national security concerns. The Waldorf review was particularly sensitive. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations had lived on the 42nd floor since 1947. Every September, the State Department took over 2 floors for the General Assembly, with hundreds of American diplomats working from hotel rooms and suites. Classified conversations occurred in those spaces. Sensitive documents were reviewed. Strategic decisions were made. The potential for Chinese intelligence services to monitor all of that activity was obvious and alarming. The State Department had been warning U.S. diplomats for years about surveillance risks in China. The warnings were explicit and detailed. All hotel rooms and offices in China are considered subject to on-site or remote technical monitoring at all times, the guidance stated. All means of communication, telephones, landline and mobile, faxes, computers, emails, instant messaging, text messages, and similar technologies are likely monitored. Travelers should be aware that hotel rooms, residences, offices, taxis, internet cafes, and other public spaces may be monitored. American officials knew this was not theoretical paranoia. It was documented reality based on counterintelligence investigations and technical sweeps that had discovered monitoring equipment. Recent context heightened concerns about Chinese cyber operations. Throughout 2014 and 2015, the United States suspected that China-linked hackers were behind a massive breach of federal personnel records at the Office of Personnel Management. The breach, which became public in 2015, compromised the personal data of more than 21 million current and former government employees, including security clearance background investigations. The stolen information included fingerprints, financial records, addresses, family members' names, and details about foreign contacts. The breach gave Chinese intelligence a comprehensive database of American government personnel that could be used for targeting, blackmail, or recruiting. On February 1, 2015, after several months of review, the Committee on Foreign Investment approved the Anbang sale. Legally, there was nothing in the transaction that met the threshold for blocking it under existing statutes. Hilton, an American company, would continue managing the hotel. The property would remain a hotel serving the public. Anbang had agreed to reasonable terms. The committee had limited authority to block transactions based on speculative future threats, especially when the immediate transaction appeared legitimate. But inside the State Department and the White House, officials were already making different plans. They would not wait to find out what China intended to install inside those walls during the renovation. They would abandon the building before construction even began. Within months of the sale's completion, President Barack Obama stopped staying at the Waldorf during New York visits. So did Vice President Joe Biden. So did Secretary of State John Kerry. The changes happened quietly, without announcement or explanation. Presidential advance teams began booking rooms at other hotels for the September 2014 UN General Assembly. In June 2015, The Associated Press reported the impending move, citing unnamed State Department officials who confirmed that the United States was reviewing its relationship with the hotel. On September 11th, 2015, the day after the final contract was signed with the New York Palace Hotel for alternative accommodations, the State Department made the announcement official. The United States would move its United Nations General Assembly operations from the Waldorf Astoria to the Palace. The government began reviewing whether the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations should continue residing at the Waldorf or relocate to different accommodations. Officials cited several considerations when explaining the decision to journalists: space limitations at the Waldorf, rising costs, security concerns in a general sense. Everyone understood the real reason. The United States government no longer trusted the building. Chinese ownership meant potential Chinese surveillance. The risk was unacceptable. Secretary Kerry's schedule for the 2015 General Assembly showed 0 meetings at the Waldorf, not one session, not a single diplomatic conversation. Foreign delegations continued using the hotel. The Russian delegation stayed there. So did dozens of other countries. But the United States had effectively declared the Waldorf Astoria compromised territory. No press conference accompanied the decision. No dramatic speeches about sovereignty or espionage. No accusations against China. Just a quiet bureaucratic shift announced in a brief State Department statement that ended 84 years of tradition. Every president from Herbert Hoover, who spoke by radio at the opening in 1931, through Barack Obama, had stayed at the Waldorf during New York visits. The ambassador had lived on the 42nd floor for 68 years, serving 13 presidents. On September 11, 2015, the relationship ended. Not with ceremony or speeches, but with a contract signed at another hotel. The Waldorf Astoria, which had housed American power for 8 decades, was now foreign territory. The hotel would remain open for another 2 years while Anbang finalized renovation plans. But the America it had represented was already gone. March 1, 2017. The Waldorf Astoria closed its doors to guests for the final time. On July 1, 2016, Anbang had announced detailed refurbishment plans. The hotel would undergo a major renovation expected to last 2 to 3 years. The plan called for converting 1,300 hotel rooms into 375 hotel rooms and 375 luxury condominiums. Floors 14 through 42 would become residential space. Floors 5 through 13 would remain hotel operations. The ground floor public spaces would be restored to their original 1931 grandeur. The final event at the hotel took place on February 28, 2017. A charity gala for New York Presbyterian Hospital, with Stevie Wonder performing for 500 guests. The next morning, March 1st, the hotel shut down all operations and began removing furniture, artwork, and guests. On March 7th, less than a week after the closure, the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission voted unanimously to protect 62,000 square feet of the hotel's public spaces as official city landmarks. The designation covered the Park Avenue lobby with its 13 murals depicting the history of New York and its floor mosaic by French artist Louis Rigaud. The wood-paneled main lobby with its black marble columns. The grand ballroom with its Czechoslovakian crystal chandeliers. The silver and black Art Deco corridors. The Basildon Room. The designation ensured that whatever happened during renovation, these spaces could not be demolished or altered beyond recognition. Any changes would require approval from the Landmarks Commission and would need to preserve the essential character and historical details. That same year, Wu Xiaohui, the chairman of Anbang who had led the Waldorf purchase, was arrested by Chinese authorities. The charges involved fraud and raising money through questionable means that violated Chinese financial regulations. Anbang's aggressive overseas investment strategy, which had included not just the Waldorf but also luxury properties in Europe and other American real estate, had been deemed reckless and potentially destabilizing by the Chinese government. In 2018, after Wu's conviction, the government seized control of Anbang Insurance Group for what it officially called economic crimes and mismanagement. Wu Xiaohui was sentenced to 18 years in prison. All of Anbang's assets, including the Waldorf Astoria, were transferred to Dajia Insurance Group, a newly created state-controlled entity. The hotel was now owned directly by the Chinese government through a wholly owned subsidiary. What had been a private Chinese company purchase became a sovereign government holding. Plans that Anbang had announced for a billionaire's private club in the basement and an exclusive gym were quietly canceled. The future of the entire project became uncertain. By 2020, the Waldorf Astoria sat silent and gutted behind construction barriers, owned by a Chinese government agency, managed through a contract that Hilton legally couldn't break, and awaiting a renovation that had already consumed far more time and money than anyone had anticipated. The hotel that had survived the Depression, 2 world wars, and profound social upheaval now faced a different kind of threat. The real possibility that it might never reopen at all. The renovation was supposed to take 3 years. It took 8. The original timeline, announced when the hotel closed in 2017, called for reopening in 2020. Reality unfolded very differently. 2020 became 2021 as construction delays mounted. Then 2021 became 2023. Then 2024. Finally, in late 2024, the hotel announced a 2025 opening date. This time, it was real. The budget, originally estimated around $1 billion for the complete renovation and conversion, ballooned to at least $2 billion. Some industry reports suggested the total investment, including the original purchase price, approached $6 billion, making it one of the most expensive hotel renovations in history. In mid-2022, with costs spiraling and the end date unclear, the project exceeded its budget so drastically that the Chinese government seriously considered selling the building or bringing in a partner developer to share costs. The ownership chaos following Anbang's collapse had created confusion about decision-making authority, budgets, and long-term strategy. Waldorf Insurance Group operated under government control but lacked the expertise or institutional knowledge that Anbang had developed. Decisions were delayed, costs increased. Complications mounted from multiple directions. The COVID-19 pandemic shut down construction for months in 2020, sending workers home and freezing progress while the city locked down. When construction resumed, supply chain disruptions made materials difficult to obtain and expensive to purchase. The ownership chaos following Anbang's collapse created bureaucratic delays as decisions required approval from multiple Chinese government agencies with unclear jurisdictions. Workplace accidents occurred, including injuries and, tragically, the death of a construction worker in 2021 when he fell from scaffolding. Labor disputes arose over safety conditions and payment schedules. At its busiest point, the renovation employed more than 1,000 workers each day across multiple shifts. Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, one of the world's most prestigious architecture firms, led the overall architectural work and building systems redesign. The firm later estimated that 96% of the hotel's interior was completely replaced rather than simply refurbished. Structural elements were reinforced. All mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems were torn out and replaced with modern equivalents. Only the landmarked public spaces, those 62,000 square feet protected by the Landmarks Commission in 2017, were carefully restored rather than demolished and rebuilt. Pierre-Yves Rochon, a French interior designer known for luxury hotel work, designed the new hotel room interiors and public spaces, creating a contemporary interpretation of the original Art Deco elegance. Jean-Louis Deniot, another prominent French designer, handled the residential condominium spaces, creating luxurious apartments with high ceilings, custom kitchens, and spa-like bathrooms. Suffolk Construction, a major American construction firm, served as general contractor, coordinating the hundreds of subcontractors, managing the complex logistics of working in a landmarked building, and ensuring compliance with New York City building codes that had changed significantly since the hotel was originally constructed in 1931. Art Care Conservation, specialists in historical preservation, restored the murals, historical woodwork, ornamental metalwork, and decorative plasterwork in the landmarked spaces, painstakingly cleaning, repairing, and stabilizing elements that were nearly a century old. The windows throughout the building were enlarged to comply with revised New York City building codes that required larger openings for fire safety. The entire mechanical infrastructure was replaced with modern systems. New elevators were installed. The electrical system was completely rewired. Modern fire suppression systems were integrated throughout. Douglas Elliman, one of New York's premier real estate firms, began marketing the condominiums in 2022 once construction progress made sales viable. Pricing started at $1.875 million for small studios. One-bedroom units began around $2.5 million. Two-bedroom residences ranged from $4 million to $7 million. Three-bedroom apartments sold for $8 million to $12 million. Four-bedroom residences exceeded $18.5 million. Penthouses commanded significantly higher prices, some reportedly listed above $30 million. The first closings on condominium sales took place in December 2024, as units received certificates of occupancy. The first residents moved into the Waldorf Towers in February 2025, becoming the newest inhabitants of apartments where presidents, composers, and displaced royalty once lived. After 8 years of delays, cost overruns, ownership chaos, and uncertainty about whether the project would ever be completed, the Waldorf Astoria was finally ready to reopen to the public. The Grand Ballroom had been restored to its original splendor. The famous lobby clock had been returned to its traditional place. The landmarked public spaces gleamed with the same Art Deco elegance they had displayed in 1931. But the hotel that would emerge would be fundamentally different from the one that closed. Smaller in terms of hotel rooms, more exclusive with luxury condominiums, and permanently separated from the American government that had once treated it as sovereign territory. On July 15th, 2025, the hotel's doors reopened to guests, 375 hotel rooms, down from nearly 1,400 before the closure, 73% fewer rooms than when it closed. 375 condominiums occupied floors 14 through 42. The residential amenities covered more than 50,000 square feet of dedicated space for condominium owners, a 25-meter starlight pool with a dramatic skylight, a state-of-the-art fitness center with personal training facilities, and a yoga studio. The Presidential Library, featuring a curated collection of books, photographs, and artifacts honoring the hotel's historic connection to American presidents. The Winter Garden, a lush bar and lounge with soaring ceilings and abundant plants. Multiple residential lounges, including the Starlight Lounge opening onto a terrace overlooking Park Avenue. A private screening room for residents. The restaurants reflected the new era while honoring the past. Lex Yard, named after the Lexington Yard railroad tracks beneath the building, was a two-story American brasserie led by acclaimed chef Michael Anthony, known for his work at Gramercy Tavern. Yoshoku served Japanese cuisine with French influences in an intimate setting. Peacock Alley, the name carried forward from the original marble corridor that connected the Waldorf and Astoria hotels in the 1890s, was reimagined as a full-service restaurant while maintaining Art Deco elegance in its design. The Gerlin Wellness Spa, spanning more than 30,000 square feet across multiple floors, opened in October 2025. One of the largest and most luxurious spas in New York City, it offered treatments, therapies, and relaxation spaces designed by the French luxury house. On September 5, 2025, the hotel's event spaces officially reopened for bookings. 43,000 square feet of meeting and celebration space, including the legendary Grand Ballroom, now fully restored and available for gatherings of up to 1,500 guests. The ballroom's 3 massive Czechoslovakian crystal chandeliers had been carefully removed during renovation, restored, and reinstalled. The silver and black Art Deco corridors gleamed. The Basildon Room, Empire Room, and other historic spaces were available for smaller events. Hotel room rates started at approximately $1,500 per night for standard rooms. Suites range from $3,000 to $10,000 per night, depending on size and location. The presidential suite, according to industry estimates, commanded rates approaching $50,000 per night for special occasions, though the hotel did not publish official pricing. Condominium sales proceeded steadily through 2025. By September, more than 30 units had closed with buyers taking ownership. The average price per square foot reached $3,272, placing the Waldorf Towers among the most expensive residential buildings in New York City, comparable to ultra-luxury properties like 157 West 57th Street and 432 Park Avenue. Managing Director Luigi Romaniello, a hospitality veteran with experience at luxury properties worldwide, presided over the reopening, overseeing staff training, operational systems, and the delicate balance between hotel operations and residential services. Historic elements had been preserved with extraordinary care and enormous expense. The famous 9-foot-tall bronze lobby clock, a fixture since 1931, stood once again beneath the Art Deco ceiling in the Park Avenue entrance. Cole Porter's Steinway grand piano, the instrument the hotel had gifted to him when he moved into the towers in 1934, and which he used to compose countless songs over 3 decades, sat on display on the cocktail terrace where hotel guests and visitors could see it. The Spirit of Achievement statue, a bronze sculpture that had marked the Park Avenue entrance since the building's opening, returned to its prominent position above the doorway. The 13 murals in the Park Avenue lobby, each depicting a scene from New York history, had been meticulously restored by conservators who spent months cleaning away decades of grime and carefully repairing damaged sections. What was different could not be seen in the architecture or decor. No sitting presidents would stay in the presidential suite during UN visits. No American diplomats would headquarter on hotel floors during the General Assembly. The U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations would not return to Suite 42A on the 42nd floor. Track 61 sat unused beneath the building, its connection to the hotel garage still intact but serving no purpose, its brass door on 49th Street leading nowhere important anymore. The hotel that reopened in 2025 was unquestionably magnificent. The Art Deco details had been restored with painstaking precision and enormous investment. The grand ballroom gleamed exactly as it had in 1931. The famous clock stood in its traditional place. The public spaces demonstrated what unlimited resources and skilled craftsmen could accomplish, but it was no longer what it had been for 8 decades. It was no longer a palace where presidents lived and nations negotiated the future of the world. It had become what its founders originally intended in 1893, a luxury hotel for wealthy visitors. The circle was complete. The story of the Waldorf Astoria is the story of American power in the 20th century. Built from family spite and social revenge in 1893, it became a symbol of Gilded Age achievement and the possibilities of American wealth. Demolished in 1929 for something taller and more modern, it was rebuilt during the depths of the Depression as what President Hoover called an exhibition of courage and confidence to the whole nation. For 8 decades after that 1931 reopening, it hosted every American president. 3 former presidents made it their permanent home, choosing to live in the Waldorf Towers rather than return to their home states. Herbert Hoover lived in Suite 31A for 20 years, conducting a post-presidency that transformed how Americans understood that office and proved that usefulness did not end with electoral defeat. The hotel became America's unofficial diplomatic palace. The future of Trieste was determined in its suites during the 1946 Council of Foreign Ministers Conference. Dead Sea Scrolls were purchased in its basement in 1954, preserving ancient texts for scholarship. The Berlin Crisis was negotiated over lunch in the Windsor Suite in 1961, with Rusk and Gromyko carefully defining their nation's vital interests. Track 61 allowed presidents to arrive unseen beneath the city, moving through Manhattan in secret and maintaining the dignity of office even when physical disability might have undermined public confidence. For nearly 70 years, the Waldorf was the place where international power gathered when it came to New York, where American presidents felt secure enough to sleep, where ambassadors felt confident enough to live permanently. In 2014, a Chinese insurance company purchased it for $1.95 billion, the highest price ever paid for a hotel anywhere in the world. A year later, without ceremony or public explanation, the United States government quietly abandoned it. 69 years of tradition ended with a bureaucratic announcement and contracts signed at a different hotel. The owner was arrested, convicted, imprisoned by his own government. His company was seized by Chinese authorities for economic crimes. The hotel sat empty for 8 years, while renovation costs spiraled from $1 billion to $2 billion, and possibly far beyond. When it finally reopened in 2025, it had been utterly transformed. 375 hotel rooms instead of 1,400. 375 luxury condominiums in the towers above, owned by a Chinese state-controlled entity. Managed by Hilton under a century-long contract that couldn't be broken. Still beautiful, still prestigious, still luxurious. Fundamentally changed in its purpose and meaning. What happens when symbols of power change hands? The Waldorf Astoria provides an answer. The architecture survives. The chandeliers still hang in the grand ballroom. The clock still stands in the lobby. Cole Porter's piano remains on display for visitors to see and photograph. But the informal power that once filled these halls has moved elsewhere. Or perhaps it hasn't moved anywhere at all. Perhaps that era of American power, the kind that gathered in hotel suites, that negotiated the future of Europe over lunch, that maintained permanent residences in a building open to the public, that trusted a commercial hotel to be sovereign American territory, is simply over. Ended not by catastrophe, but by the quiet mathematics of global capital and the changing balance of power in the 21st century. The hotel endures as a monument to what was lost, not through war or revolution or natural disaster, but through a real estate transaction and the rational calculations of security officials who understood that walls can contain microphones and that sovereignty is ultimately about trust. Today, tourists can visit the Grand Ballroom for events and celebrations. They can dine at the restaurants, admire the Art Deco interiors lovingly restored at enormous expense. See the famous clock that has stood in the lobby since the hotel opened its doors 94 years ago. They can book rooms where history was made, where presidents slept, where diplomats met in secret. What they cannot access is what mattered most: the informal power that once filled these halls, the late-night negotiations that determined the fate of cities, the chance encounters between presidents and foreign ministers that shaped policy, the living room of American diplomacy where allies gathered and adversaries met. That is gone, preserved in photographs and official memoranda and the memories of aging diplomats, but no longer present in the building itself. The Waldorf Astoria was never just a hotel. It was the place where American power lived when it came to New York. That power built it, inhabited it for 8 decades, shaped its identity and purpose, and ultimately left it behind when circumstances changed and trust disappeared. What remains is architecture, spectacular, meticulously preserved, empty of the political meaning it once held. The question isn't whether the hotel survived. The hotel clearly survived, renovated and restored and reopened to great acclaim. The question is what survived of the America that built it and lived in it and trusted it with secrets. The lobby clock still stands beneath the Art Deco ceiling, marking time as it has for nearly a century. Cole Porter's piano sits where visitors can see it and remember the composer who created American standards in an apartment upstairs. The Grand Ballroom can still hold 1,500 guests beneath crystal chandeliers. Everything that could be preserved has been preserved with extraordinary care and unlimited resources. Everything except the one thing that mattered most. The Waldorf Astoria is no longer the place where American power gathers. It is a museum to that power. Beautiful, meticulous, lovingly restored, and utterly transformed in its essential nature. The hotel survived. The era it represented did not.